I'm going to focus my remarks, and I think it's appropriate because, of course, there isn't much to add to the strategic geopolitical summary that was excellently just presented. And I think that in the question-answer session, some disagreements, there will be an attempt to tease out disagreements, I hear. But let's see if there are many of those. But I think, let me begin by commenting on a piece of history. And then you'll see where I'm going with this. In 1940, Stalin successfully managed to arrange the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico. And yet the USSR continued as a state until 1991. And so the interscene infighting between various factions, ideological factions within the USSR, though of course damaging to the entity, they were not terminal, and the USSR continued to pose a significant challenge to the rest of the world until 91 and its dissolution. Now, to paraphrase a former president of the United States, the reason I believe that is, and I will of course be readjusting the sentence, is it's the ideology, stupid. And whereas David mentioned that he believes that our approach so far to dealing with the challenge posed by Al-Qaeda and its supporters and affiliates around the world, post 9/11, has been a failure, what I will attempt to elaborate upon is what I believe is one of the missing links, one of the reasons why this policy has been a failure, and that's the ideology. And that's us not coming to grips with an understanding of the ideology, nor wanting to. In fact, there are people who work within the industry who are committed to advocating the idea that the ideology isn't that significant. Now, what I want to say is that whereas legal and military measures to strike at terrorist threats are indeed very significant, just as it was significant that Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin. The reason that Soviet communism continued to survive and inspire was because the ideology was stronger than any one given personality. And so the approach post 9/11, if one were to caricature it, what was known as the neoconservative era, and I recognize this is a caricature, but I will use it just to drive home the point, the approach was one of an attempt to impose democracy at the barrel of a gun. And that led to wars and it led to invasions with a view to an attempt to defeat the terrorist threat and impose from the top down a different order. That led to our entrenched positions within Iraq and Afghanistan, and as was correctly said, an even longer attempt to withdraw from those two countries. And with the ushering in of the new administration, a re-evaluation took place. And whereas the previous caricature that I used was attempting to impose democracy at the barrel of a gun, during the new phase of Obama's administration, they decided to ditch the democracy piece but keep the gun. And so instead of neoconservatism, we had what I term neoconservatism light. And that was a policy of decapitations, no pun intended, but to take out the leaderships of the terrorist organizations that were seen as a threat by assassinating as many leaders as possible through drone strikes, through various aerial bombardments, an attempt to decapitate the leadership of Al-Qaeda. That's what I'm referring to as neoconservatism light. And again, I recognize these are caricatures. I'm attempting to drive home a point here, that in general, that was the policy shifted in that direction. There was also a view at the same time, whilst the leadership were being taken out, there was a view that the best guarantor against the hard-edged terrorism of groups such as Al-Qaeda was to contain them an attempt to contain them through the softer groups, what was seen as the softer groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood. An analogy was drawn between terrorist organizations and organized crime. It was believed that the phase should have moved from one of active warfare to dealing with these groups as one deals with the mafia. Arrest, suppress, take out the leadership, because effectively these are groups that are organized, centralized, and if you take out the leadership, they fall into disarray. Both approaches fail to recognize the regenerative power of the ideology. It shouldn't be too controversial for me to say this now after what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria. And in fact, the net gain here, the winner overall, hasn't been Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It hasn't been the Muslim Brotherhood or my former organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir. The winner has been the ideology itself. Because whereas these groups are struggling and competing with each other, the premise upon which they struggle, what are they fighting over, are the principles of this ideology. And so in this struggle, they are merely reinforcing in the wider population these principles. The fight is over the principles, not about whether to leave the principles. And indeed, the ideology caters for that fight as well, which I'll get to. It's not, as is often believed, a deviation from the ideology for Muslim to kill Muslim. Yes, it has propaganda value for us to present it as such, but the ideology is full of justifications for how and when and why Muslims can kill Muslims as well, going all the way back to the first Caliph of Islam. And as I said, I'll come to that. Because we have to understand this point, that where the Al-Qaeda and ISIS struggle, yes, it's an operational weakness, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a dilution of the ideology, and therefore doesn't necessarily translate into being less appealing to those who are drawn to this brand. First of all, what do I mean by the ideology? And at this stage, I want to be absolutely clear, I'm not talking about the religion of Islam. The religion of Islam, like any other religion and any other dogma, indeed, any other political ideology as well, has its various factions and disagreements and sects and denominations. The religion of Islam is interpreted by 1.5 billion Muslims in as many ways around the world. There is no correct interpretation of Islam. And Prime Minister David Cameron's recent remarks where he said ISIS are not Muslims, they are monsters, what he should have really said was, ISIS do not represent all Muslims, they are monsters. Because indeed, there is no correct interpretation of any religion. ISIS has a perverted interpretation. There are many other interpretations, but Islam as a religion cannot be defined by the practices of any one terrorist organization. So what do I mean by the ideology? I mean a specific politicization of that religion, as best summarized in the following sentence. A desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society, which is different to an individual, no matter how conservative they may be, wishing to adhere to that faith within their homes and their families. The religion has all of the usual struggles one would expect from within a religion. The moderates versus the reformers versus the traditionalists. But this particular ideology attempts to supersede all of those denominational struggles by focusing on the politicized. A desire to impose any given interpretation of that faith over society. And that's what I refer to as the ideology of Islamism. Now, it's important to know what I mean by the word Islamism, because what I don't want this debate or discussion to become is one of semantics. And that's why I've defined it very clearly. I'm not talking about the religion, I'm talking about the desire to impose it. I happen to use the word Islamism. For all I care, you can call it political terrorism in the form of an ideological manipulation of the religion. I just think using one word makes it easier to refer to. What is Islamism? Broken down into detail, I'd like to give you 4 points here. First of all, it's the belief that the religion is not a religion but an ideology, answering all of life's problems, whether they be economic, educational, scientific, social, administrative, that this is a complete and total and perfect ideology that enters into every sphere of your practice in life. How to wash, how to eat, all the way up to how to run an economy. Passages from Scripture are used to justify this understanding, that it's a complete ideology as opposed to a religion. Such as the passage from the Quran, that today we have completed your religion. And analogies are drawn among and within Islamist circles to communism. That the real competitor to Islam isn't Christianity or Judaism, but is indeed the other existing totalitarian ideologies that are out there. So that's the first pillar of belief of the Islamist ideology. The second is the law for this ideology must be a form of Sharia. And so an attempt to synchronize law with an interpretation of the Sharia would form a core part of this ideology. The third is that the people who belong to this ideology and who must adhere to this law are the Islamic Ummah, or the nation of Muslims. And so the idea of Ummah, which has existed within traditional understandings of the religion, here has turned into a polity, a citizenship for Muslims. So as opposed to being a religious identity akin to the global Catholic community, the Ummah has become a political identity, more akin to the international proletariat of the former USSR. And the final pillar of this ideology, we have the understanding it's an ideology with the law as Sharia, with the people as the Ummah, and the state is what they would call the caliphate. And here just a slight divergence from the previous speaker. There is no distinction within Islamist theory between a caliphate and the caliphate. There is only the caliphate. There are distinctions between states that are Islamic. So the term Dawla, when Boko Haram declared an Islamic state, the speech didn't explicitly reference a caliphate. It said it was a state among the Islamic states. That's where you can have more than one, because they are emirates. The Taliban only ever declared an Islamic emirate. But the moment you announce a caliphate, there is only one that's ever recognized to have any legitimacy. It's the one that is announced. And that's based on the tradition from the hadith, إِذَا بُوِعَ لِلْخَلِيفَتَيْنِ فَاقْتُلُوا الْآخِرُ مِنْهُمَا. If there has been given a pledge of allegiance for two caliphs, then kill the latter of them. And we'll get back to the significance of some of this in the struggle between IS and Al-Qaeda. So the state, the fourth pillar of this ideology is the state, is the caliphate. So you have the ideology, the law, the people, and the state. All of this comes together, is pulled together by a doctrine of jihad. How to spread the borders of that state is through expansionist offensive jihad. And that would be perhaps the fifth pillar. Or you could see it as a means to spread the four. Now here I want to distinguish, as I did between Islam and Islamism, between the traditional concept of jihad and what I refer to as jihadism. So if Islamism was the desire to impose any given interpretation of Islam over society, jihadism is the use of force to spread Islamism. That's what I mean by the term. Whereas jihad is a traditional theological understanding of struggle. It could involve physical and it could involve personal struggle. and is as interpretable as the rest of the religion. But jihadism specifically is the use of force to spread Islamism. And I've deliberately kept that definition broad because, of course, the use of force to spread Islamism could be the use of terrorist force or it could be the use of conventional warfare. All I mean when I refer to the term jihadism is the use of force to spread Islamism, meaning violence as motivated by the spread of Islamism. Now, with the ideology thus defined, the goal has always been to create the caliphate. From the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, through to the offshoot Hizb ut-Tahrir, through to the various jihadist groups that emerged via Sayyid Qutb in the prisons of Egypt, indeed in the prison in which I was held. Whether they be Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya or Al-Jihad al-Islami in Egypt, the equivalent of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks of Egypt. And from there, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, all the way through to the offshoots and the franchises, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, and eventually to IS. The goal has always been to create the caliphate. The dispute between all of these organizations has been about the how, not the whether. And the dispute is briefly as follows. The Muslim Brotherhood are what I call the political Islamists. Their desire was to establish this caliphate by working politically within the existing regimes. This policy was known as tadarruj, gradualism. It's explicitly referenced within their literature. Tadarruj means entryism. It's to work within regimes to affect to Islamicize those regimes for the purpose of these 5 principles. Some of you may have heard of the recent schools controversy in the United Kingdom, in the city of Birmingham, where state schools, secular state schools, fell victim to the policy of tadarruj within the United Kingdom. And I don't say this to be sensationalist, that was the conclusion of 2 separate official United Kingdom government inquiries. So the policy of tadarruj is very real. It's the oldest policy in terms of the method to establish the caliphate, and has been very effective. It was very effective, as was referred to in the previous speech, particularly in Egypt, after the Arab uprisings. Because it means using legitimate means to arrive at these 5 principles. But this policy has been around since 1928. By 1953, certain organizations became disillusioned and wanted to, as happened again with the ideology of communism, wanted to ratchet up the tempo and became impatient with this elusive caliphate. And so within and around Jerusalem, influenced by the ideas of this organization and another one that was influenced heavily by them in the Indian subcontinent, and the ideas of Maududi and Jamaat-e-Islami, which became slightly more radical and dogmatic than the original Muslim Brotherhood. Influenced by these 2, a third group emerged, and that was Hizb ut-Tahrir. And this ushered in the phase of what I call the revolutionary Islamists. So rather than working simply within the legitimate processes that exist within any regime, the ballot box and the institutions of society, Hizb ut-Tahrir decided instead to abandon those institutions, abandon hope in the ballot box, and work exclusively with the armed forces of targeted Muslim majority states such as Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, with a view to once recruiting these army officers, inciting military coups, for the purpose again of these 5 principles. And just as the policy of tadarruj is very real, the policy of talab al-nusra, as Hizb ut-Tahrir refers to it, the seeking of the support of those who have the power, al-nusra means the material support, that policy is also very real. Just ask any Pakistani military officer. In fact, the history of military coups incited by Hizb ut-Tahrir goes all the way back to the genesis of Jihad al-Islami in Egypt. As confirmed to me directly by one of those who were convicted for the assassination of Anwar Sadat in Egypt, in prison. It was originally Hizb ut-Tahrir that was behind the cells that were attempting to overthrow Sadat. A man by the name of Salim al-Rahal was captured and expelled from Egypt. And the people he recruited to his group, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which he didn't call Hizb ut-Tahrir because prior to that, a man by the name of the military academy case in Egypt was an attempted coup prior to this attempt. So they didn't use the word Hizb ut-Tahrir. Instead, they used the word jihad. And when Salim al-Rahal was expelled from Egypt, his students, those who had learnt this ideology from him, went on to form Islamic Jihad and went on to assassinate Anwar Sadat in what was effectively an attempted coup, not merely an assassination. We had the case of the military academy, then we had the case of the assassination of Sadat in Egypt. Beyond that, there were coup attempts in Jordan and Iraq, and specifically in Pakistan. There have been 2 or 3 coup attempts by members of this organization, or at least plots have been discovered in the armed forces. So just as the policy of tadarruj was very real, the policy of attempting to infiltrate the armed forces, to incite military coups against existing regimes, to seize power in that way, is also very real. But again, certain organizations became disillusioned. And so from there, the jihadist groups emerged. Specifically in Egypt, post Hizb ut-Tahrir's expulsion from Egypt, a very large jihadist group, the largest in Egypt at the time, was Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, and then the smaller, more ideologically dogmatic, was Jihad al-Islami, which Ayman al-Zawahiri led. Both of these, Jihad al-Islami and Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, were offshoots of the original Islamic Jihad in Egypt that assassinated Anwar Sadat, which was originally an offshoot of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which was originally an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know what happened next because of Afghanistan. But the key point here is, what was the shift that occurred between the Egyptian jihad groups and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And it was the doctrine that David referred to in terms of the near enemy and the far enemy. And instrumental in that, in formulating that doctrine, was Ayman al-Zawahiri, now the leader of Al-Qaeda. Influential in forming that doctrine, even with regards to bin Laden. The real ideologue in this debate as to whether we should strike at the states or whether we should strike at the local regimes was Ayman al-Zawahiri. And he said that there is the adu al-ba'id and the adu al-qarib, the far enemy and the near enemy. And his theory was as followed, and let's see how closely it matches up to what's happened subsequently. That the reason we can't overthrow the Arab regimes, and we've been trying since 1928, this is the phenomenon of Islamism, referred to as such by the Islamists themselves, the Tayyar al-Islami, the phenomenon of Islamism. They recognize we're dealing here with an entire ideological phenomenon, and not just one group or the other, and its successes or failures. But the phenomenon of Islamism, the reason why it's failed to succeed so far, is because the West, if there ever was such a homogeneous entity as the West, has been supporting Arab dictators for so long and has preferred security over democracy. So if we can make the West pay the cost of that support for security over democracy, they'll pull back and leave our affairs to ourselves, and the Arab people, when their destiny is in their own hands, will overthrow these regimes. All we need to do is provoke them, because by provoking them, we'll force them to come further and further and deeper entrenched into these regimes and their support for them, thereby increasing the hatred for the West in the hearts and minds of the Arab peoples, and intensifying the struggle between the Arab peoples and the West, leading to the overthrow of these regimes. This will leave a vacuum in the Middle East for us to be able to establish the caliphate. This was Ayman al-Zawahiri's vision. What I would argue is that all of that's come true apart from the last point. It wasn't Ayman Zawahiri who established this caliphate, but IS. But what IS have done is not, it does not detract from Ayman al-Zawahiri's original vision. It's an attempt to fulfill that vision. In ideological terms, it's a continuation, even though in operational terms, it's a break. And what I'd argue is, in fact, what happened and played out in the Middle East, largely not due to the fact that Ayman Zawahiri was some prophet that was able to predict the future, but largely because of the approach that we took, originally as I caricatured, admittedly, as an attempt to impose democracy at the barrel of a gun, and then an attempt to ditch the democracy piece and maintain the gun. What we didn't recognize is that no matter how many ideologues we killed, this ideology would always breed more. And the ideology would gain in strength even if each or any given organization became weaker. And that's what I'm arguing has happened. And this moves me to the next point, which is, if the goal was always the caliphate, how is this a continuation? If IS are killing other Muslims, if they're slaughtering even other Al-Qaeda members. Let's not forget that all of this is very, very real to their protagonists, even if it sounds mythological to everyone here. It's very real to those who adhere to it. And when they see history repeating itself, for them, it's a sign that God is on their side. And so the state that they believe Prophet Muhammad established in Medina was a state that was instantly attacked by all the powers surrounding it, including the Roman and the Persian empires. This is the mythology as it stands in their mindsets, and it's how they managed to recruit and attract so many people to their group. That the state that the Prophet Muhammad established in Medina was immediately attacked by all surrounding powers, including the Roman and the Persian empires. There's a famous battle known as the Battle of Badr, where it is said that 300 of the Prophet's soldiers defeated 1,000 of their enemies. Exactly as IS are claiming they have done with the fall of Mosul. It is then said that the powers that be around the days of the Prophet Muhammad's state, which isn't called a caliphate because caliphate means successor to the Prophet. This was the original Islamic State. The caliphate began with the first caliph after his death, Abu Bakr. But the original state of the Prophet was then, on a regional basis, a coalition was gathered against it. The entire world's powers at the time came to defeat this state in Medina in what was known as a Battle of the Trench. And the people of Medina dug a trench around the city, and the siege was defeated. So the coalition currently being built up against the IS, in the minds of those ideologues, is a repeat of the Battle of the Trench, after the lightning speed victory of the Battle of Badr. And they believe that coalition is bound to be defeated, which is why they're welcoming it and embracing it with open arms. Not to say it shouldn't happen, by the way, just allowing you to sort of understand their mindset. They welcome it with open arms because they believe this is a sign that exactly as what happened to the Prophet is happening to them. The world will gather against them. They will dig in their heels. They will fight a repeat of the Battle of the Trench. That will be the decisive moment when God will grant them victory, after the lightning speed victories they've already had. The Muslim-on-Muslim violence isn't a problem whatsoever, because the first caliph himself fought against the rebels in what is known as the Harb al-Ridda, or the Wars of Apostasy, killing all of those tribes that attempted to break away after the passing of the Prophet. Because violence against other Muslims in state building has already been legitimized by the ideology. It always was. A political interpretation of the life of the Prophet Muhammad and his successors justified violence against other Muslims from day one, from the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. In fact, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the revolutionary Islamist group I spoke about earlier, explicitly references in its books that when the state is established, millions upon millions will die in an attempt to spread the borders of this state, and refers to killing Muslims specifically as those who don't give the bay'ah or the pledge of allegiance to the caliph. They will be known as the rebels, or the bugha, which is the term the first Caliph Abu Bakr used in attempting to force all of those others back under his control after the passing of Prophet Muhammad. Those wars were known as both Harb al-Ridda, the wars of apostasy, and Harb al-Baghi, the wars of rebellion. And that's what led to the original Sunni-Shia split, the original Sunni-Shia divide in the first place. So none of this is inconsistent with that politicized reading of the religion. And therefore, I'd argue, is not a weakness in the ideology. And so, if it's correct that we're failing to recognize that this ideology continues to thrive, continues to draw people to its ranks, regardless of which organization happens to be operating or competing with which, then what can be done? What I'm not saying is that military or legal means must stop. What I'm not saying is that the coalition against the IS group is a bad thing. I'm not saying any of that. The means of law and war both have their respective places in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. What I'm arguing is that a holistic approach must be taken. That as well as the means of law and war, where appropriate, we must recognize that they are bound to fail if done in isolation, without an attempt to also undermine these 5 principles of the ideology. Undermine the fact that this religion is an ideology, undermine that the law must be Sharia, undermine that the people or the ummah is a political rather than a religious bloc, undermine the very concept of recreating the caliphate, and undermine the idea of politicized jihad. An alternative way of understanding these used and abused concepts within the theology must be popularized. Because right now, if you conducted a survey, I guarantee you these surveys have been done. If you conducted a survey and asked the average everyday Muslim if they support IS, they will say no, a resounding no. But if you ask them if they support the creation of a caliphate, you'll hear a resounding yes. And that's the difference between the way in which, because I would argue it wasn't capitalism that defeated communism in the Middle East, it was Islamism. Islamism as an ideology eclipsed communism in Afghanistan, eclipsed the Ba'athist Arab socialist movement. Indeed, the Ba'athists are now joining the Islamists in the Middle East. They're recognizing the new zeitgeist is this ideology. And something else needs to emerge to eclipse that. But so far, nothing has been organized on the grassroots. Nothing, no alternative brand has emerged. And certainly no structure or organization has emerged to preach it. Instead, recognizing the power of and the allure of this ideology, regional states have got involved in a regional conflict. Some of this was referred to, but I want to go into a bit more detail and then conclude. Whichever state is interfering in the Middle East, and there are now broadly 3 camps, they are, by their actions, reinforcing this ideology. So the Iran-Syria axis is reinforcing the ideology by using an Islamist organization as a proxy. It happens to be a Shia Islamist organization, Hezbollah, to shore up support for Assad in Syria. And then you have a Qatar and Turkey regional friendship, again supporting opposition groups to Assad in Syria. This is no judgment on any one of these, it's just what's going on, really, for your knowledge. But those opposition groups in themselves are varying degrees or shades of the Islamist or jihadist ideological groups. Even those who are opposed to IS, such as Ahrar al-Sham, an organization that recently lost most of its leadership. And then the third axis is the Saudi Arabian, Emirates, and Egyptian alliance in the region, preferring security and stability over change. What I would argue, again, in danger of reinforcing the security versus democracy paradigm that the Islamists are so adept at playing off. And so the net gain in all of this has been the ideology and the recruitment to it. And at each stage, each group has been outflanked to the right and thereby resists calls for moderation. And that's because no alternative grassroots phenomenon, no alternative tayyar has been created to stem the rise and the appeal of the Islamist ideology.